Is now back in session. This morning we received a request from the two defense teams regarding the time allocation for this expert. And we granted a request. However, that would be extended only for today's session through 4:30, and likewise the same thing for 4:30 tomorrow afternoon. That is the limitation of the grant. The floor is now given to Nuon Chia's defense to put questions to this expert. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are quite grateful for the extra half hour that we're having. I will try to speed as much as I can with my questions to the expert. Good afternoon, Mr. Short. You have gathered by now that I am the International Counsel for Nuon Chia. Like I said, although I have many questions for you on the things that you have been testifying about today and yesterday, I do feel I need to go back to the very beginning in which you were telling about your background, academic background, and your professional career. I do have a few questions on that, if you don't mind. I understand that you've been a foreign correspondent in China, in Beijing. Which other places in the world have you been a correspondent for the BBC in?
I worked for the BBC in Africa, then in Moscow, then in Beijing, then in Paris, finally in Tokyo and Washington.
So Moscow and Beijing were the cities at that time in former communist countries. And how long have you been in Moscow, respectively, Beijing?
I was in Moscow for 3 years, from the beginning of 1974 to the very end of 1976. Then, in 1977, I went to Beijing and left late in 1981.
You said something 2 days ago about your academic background. If I understood correctly, you studied sciences and English literature. Am I correct in saying that you are not a historian in the academic sense? You're not a scholar of history?
You are correct. I have had no formal academic training as a history professor or a history lecturer, as is true of many other historians.
You're right. Let me be more specific. You are not an academic scholar in the sense of being an academic expert in communism, socialism, etc. For instance, like people like David Priestland or Archie Brown or Steve Hedder, for that matter.
I am not, and I would not pretend to be, nor would I wish to be.
But I'm not here, Mr. Short. Have you ever published in academic magazines or journals in respect of the theoretical foundations of communism?
I have been asked to peer review articles for academic journals on that subject. I must say I have found most of them not very good, but I have not written myself.
And is it fair to say that what you have written on matters in respect of communism would be your two books, one, the biography of Mao, and two, the biography of Pol Pot? Is that correct?
That is not entirely correct. My first book on communism was a comparison of the Chinese system after Mao and the Soviet system after Khrushchev, after Stalin. It was called The Dragon and the Bear, and it was a comparison of how those two communist systems evolved after the principal leaders had disappeared, and Khrushchev on the one hand and Deng Xiaoping on the other had taken their place.
And the sources of your knowledge leading up to those respective books, was that mainly gathered during your foreign correspondentship for the BBC in those cities?
Yes, I think that would be true. A reading of the Soviet press, of the academic literature, also of Russian studies, because I read Russian. In China, it was much more a study, because the system after Mao was evolving at the time I was there. It was much more a matter of observation, what I saw, the way that the communist apparatus changed, rather than archival resources.
Thank you. Now let me turn to Cambodia. If I understand it correctly, you have not been in Cambodia or DK before 1975. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
You have testified earlier that you have, in the DK period, tried to get a visa to visit the country, but you were unsuccessful in that respect. Have you visited Cambodia between 75 and the moment in 1999 or 2000 when you started your research for the book that we've been discussing today and yesterday?
Yes, I came to Cambodia in 1991. You will correct me as to the exact date, but it was shortly around the time that Prince Sihanouk returned from Beijing. And I spent, I think, about 3 weeks here at that time.
But that was in respect of your correspondentship, or was it?
No,
And before 1999, when you came here to start researching for your book, have you done any other research in Cambodia or outside Cambodia? Or is it really 1999 as a first moment that you were starting thinking and writing about Cambodia?
$1999 was the beginning. I spent about 5 years, from 1999 to 2004, working on the book and working full-time. I was not doing anything else. When I was in Beijing in the 1970s, I followed events in DK extremely closely. It was the best place, apart perhaps from Bangkok, but it was at least a privileged a viewpoint, because the Chinese were the closest allies, and there were people in Beijing who knew probably better than anyone else what was going on in DK.
just testified that you speak Russian. Do you speak Khmer?
No, I do not. Sadly, there are limits to the number of languages one can learn.
Indeed. But did you, when you were writing or researching your book, find that a handicap, not being able to speak or understand yourself directly the Khmer language?
In some cases, of course. In others, no, because Kyu Sampon, for example, Ying Suri speak very good French. So we conversed in French, and this was not a problem.
That I understand. I'm asking you this question for the following reason. Not speaking Khmer, not really having been able to study in depth Khmer culture, etc., before 1999. Notwithstanding that, you make quite, in your book at least, if I may phrase it like this, sweeping statements about the Khmer culture or the Khmer behavior. You call the Khmer lazy. You say that they're having inferiority complexes. You use the Theravada Buddhism as a source for explanation. What did you feel that? I see my learned friend standing.
Mr. President.
Mr. Expert, please wait the prosecution. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. We object. That was a sweeping statement seeking to clarify, seeking to characterize Mr. Short's work as consisting of sweeping statements. The way these questions should be posed is by taking him to specific portions of his book so that we can all look at the relevant extracts, and then they can be put to the expert and questions can be asked. So we object to this form of questioning.
I understand, Mr. President, the technical objection, but I just try to speed up things. I mean, we've all read it, and I'm sure Mr. Short knows that he wrote it, and my point is to speed up and ask him about it. And not necessarily asking whether he actually wrote that, because he knows he wrote it, just asking how he was dealing with the fact that he has written that, and what was his ideas behind it due to his lack of knowledge of certain things, in my opinion.
President, the objection ground by the prosecution is valid, thus sustained. The experts, you do not need to respond to the last question put to you by Nguyen Thie's defense. Counsel for Nguyen Thie, you are instructed to focus your questions on the 11 facts that are being processed before this court.
Very well, Mr. President. I will rephrase the question. Has your research made you conclude that, in general, the Khmer people were suffering from an inferiority complex in respect of Vietnam?
I think, I honestly can't remember whether I used the term inferiority complex. I possibly did. It is certainly a way of describing the peculiar vulnerability that historically has been Cambodia's vis-à-vis its two much more powerful neighbors. As a point of fact, so that we don't make sweeping statements in your term, I certainly have not said the Khmer people were lazy. That is not anything I've written. I've quoted others who took that view, and I have said there were ways of interpreting this. Doing only as much work as you needed to live can be laziness to some, but wisdom to others.
That is correct. You have used others to bring about that point. But have I understand your book correctly that you try also to make a point with the laziness in respect of DK policy? It was very difficult for DK leadership to move the Khmer people in general to work.
They certainly felt that, the DK leadership. Whether they could obviously have used different ways of doing it. They chose a particular way, and yes, I think they did feel that it was very difficult to get this country moving, and that is part of the explanation for the very harsh methods which they chose to use.
Let me move on, Mr. Short. There are more important points. When you started researching your book, there was already quite a bulk of literature. People had written about the DK period and the period leading up to DK. Would you be able now today to name, if we limit ourselves to three important things that you have discovered on the basis of your research that hadn't already been put forward or argued by scholars like Kiernan, Chandler, Heder, etc.? Is there anything in your book you say, well, that is something that I have established based on my own research that others hadn't done before?
With no difficulty at all. You mentioned Chandler and Heder and Kiernan. We don't want to get into a scholarly argument, but I disagree with a great deal of what Kiernan wrote. It was an early attempt, and in my view was, in many respects, totally misguided. Chandler, a very sound work, but again, it was early, and there are whole sections, whole segments, where basically in his books, he says, we don't know what happened. We don't know where Pol Pot was at this time, what he was doing. Well, in my book, because I went to talk to former Khmer Rouge leaders and officials, those gaps are filled in. We now know where he was, what he was doing. We don't know what he was thinking necessarily, but a lot of what he was saying and writing throughout the period we're talking about. And please remember, my book is not a history of DK. It is a biography of Pol Pot. It's about Pol Pot's life. Another aspect which has been written about a great deal since, but had not been written at that time, is we discussed this morning, the influence of Buddhism on the form taken by Cambodian communism. Yet another is the form taken by the study sessions, the the motivation for this egalitarian policy which the Khmer Rouge endeavored to impose, that had not been written about in anything remotely like that kind of detail, because none of those concerned on the Khmer Rouge side had spoken. The fundamental difference between my work and that which had preceded it was that the great majority of the books before had been written from sources other than the Khmer Rouge themselves, and I endeavored to base my book on an understanding of their mentality, what they were going for.
I understand your answer, Mr. Short. You oppose the view on certain aspects of Ben Kiernan. You say many things developed since Chandler wrote his last book. But would you be able, on the basis of your interviews or your discovery of new documentary material, just to give 1, 2, maybe 3 really poignant examples of things that are your discovery?
Well, I thought I just did, but if you want more specific things, the Pol Pot's discussions with Mao in Beijing in 1975, no text had ever been made available in any other, well, in any language, because in China it was a secret text in the archives. It hadn't been published anywhere else. The whole period of Pol Pot's stay in Ratanakiri, and indeed at Office 100, very little had appeared about that until I talked to Ying Sari about it, and then other sources filled in gaps. You're asking me to pick needles out of a very, there is there is an enormous amount in that book which had not appeared before. I claim no special merit, but it is a fact.
Let me go further on that. You mentioned speaking to Ying Sari. Other people have spoken to him as well. Steve Hatter, for instance, has spoken to him. But you also testified that both Khieu Samphan and Ying Sari were not very inclined to speak about post-75 events. You've also described Ying Sari as, in your book, as manipulative and devious. What made you conclude that whatever he had said was really something new or never been said before?
That which is new is by definition that which has not appeared before. What further proof of newness are you asking me to give you? If it hasn't appeared before, and remember again, we talked this morning about chronology. Yes, others have talked to Ying Sari, not before me. I was the first to interview him at length, and again, we're talking about 2000. The war, the last guerrilla movements ended in 1999. I may be wrong, but my impression is that he had not, at that time, started to discuss with others in any detail the things which we talked about the early periods of the movement.
Let me try it from another angle, if you allow me, Mr. Short. Would you be able to tell if you had fundamentally different insights in the functioning or working of DK other than Chandler, Hatter, or Kiernan?
I think that is for the reader to judge. It's not for the author to say, the writer to say, you've never seen anything like this before. You put your book out there, your work of research, and it is then up to readers to say, oh, I've read all that 10 times before, or no, that's new, I didn't know that, that's interesting. I think you're asking me something which I am not the best person to judge. Of course, I think that there are many things which are new, that there is an interpretation which is new, and certainly which is much fuller than has appeared before, but I am not the one to say so.
Do you know if Chandler, Keenan or Heather have ever reviewed your book? Whether they ever wrote a what's the word? Exactly. Thank you.
Both David Chandler and Steve Hedder were kind enough to read the complete text before it was published. You're going to embarrass me. Chandler said it was a masterpiece which Steve Hedder should have written but had not done so. And Steve, without making any general comment, picked out various things which he objected to, but was not in fundamental disagreement on any point. Stephen Hedder and I disagree fundamentally, and it came out in his comments, over whether the Khmer Rouge revolution was more Cambodian or more communist. It's an old argument, and that was our point of disconnection.
Now, since you've raised it, have you been able to incorporate in your work Steve Hedder's book titled Cambodian Communism and the Vietnamese Model?
I think I'm right in saying that came out afterwards. When was it published?
I think it was published in the same year as your book.
No, I didn't see it. I don't think so. He also produced a book about 7 candidates for prosecution. That I did have, I think, yes, I had that before, but not the other one.
I'm asking you this because in the foreword to that very same book of Steve Hedder, the foreword is by David Chandler, and it has been written in 2003. So apparently David Chandler had a manuscript of that book. Did you have, before finishing your book, a manuscript of Steve Hedder's book?
No, I didn't. I gave him mine to read. He obviously didn't give me his.
As you said, as we agreed, Steve Hedder is an important scholar on Cambodian communism. Have you read his book later, and on the basis of that book, come to other insights in respect of the ideology of the Khmer Rouge?
I honestly cannot tell you. We are talking about, if I read it, I would have read it when it was published, and that's now 8 or 9 years ago. I have been deeply involved in other subjects since. Might I be permitted to make one remark additionally? Steve Hedder and others like him, David Chandler, and for a time Ben Kiernan, devoted their entire energy and lives to studying Cambodia. It's a narrow focus which goes very deeply into one subject. My qualifications are different. I have looked at and lived under communist systems in Russia and China, which they have not. I've tried to understand many different systems, cultures in different parts of the world. That provides a very different perspective for looking at what happened here to the focus of an academic who works only on that subject. I'm not saying one is better, one is worse. They are different.
Just, Mr. Short, trying to establish whether after the publication of your book you have read Stephen Hedder's book or you have been able to study it.
I can only repeat my answer. I have no recollection of reading it. I may have read it, but it's not something which stuck in my mind.
Now, I believe, and the prosecutor will correct me if I'm wrong, Steve Hedder is being qualified as the world's leading scholar on Cambodian communism. Now, you've been testifying as an expert today and yesterday about the ideology of the Khmer Rouge and what they were about. Now, doesn't it seem strange to you that you've been giving this testimony without having read the leading book of the leading scholar on Cambodian communism?
I'm not here simply to regurgitate or to reflect the views of another scholar, and I would agree with you, Steve Hedder probably is the world's leading scholar on Cambodian communism. That does not mean we are in a academic debate is where truth is established. One may study a subject and draw conclusions. One is not obliged to read the interpretation of someone else. As I say, I may well have done so. I simply don't remember. It's nearly 10 years ago. I've read maybe 1,000 books since on different subjects. You're asking me something which is long ago.
Okay, Mr. Short, I will be returning to Hedder's book shortly. I have a few other questions to you. On a few occasions, today and yesterday, you've been speaking about the secrecy of the Khmer Rouge. Almost as it was an obsession, the secrecy. You've been speaking about Nguyen Chia, about the opaque master of secrecy, etc., etc. Did that in any way form a handicap in trying to find out what really happened, or what was really in the minds, as you put it, of the Khmer Rouge leaders? Nguyen Chia didn't speak, Yang Sari didn't speak really about the post-75 period. Others didn't really speak at all. How did that hinder you in nevertheless making the conclusions that you have been taking or making today and yesterday?
Yang Sari and Khieu Samphan, I said they were reticent. It was not a subject they wished to be expansive on, but both of them gave answers on certain questions about that period. The secrecy issue, I thought, and I believe, was an important part of the modus operandi of the Khmer Rouge. It was not unique to them. The Vietnamese communists used code words, code names, to a considerable extent, a little less than in Cambodia. The Chinese, much less. But this was part of the DK and CPK system. So it wasn't a handicap as such. What was a handicap was, I wouldn't call it secrecy, but people's reluctance, understandably, to speak about highly contentious issues. the right to keep silent, the right not to speak. I can't force people to say what they don't want to say. I can merely try to draw them out and draw lessons from what they do say.
Let me, if you allow me, Mr. Short, to approach it from another angle. The goal of your research and your book, as you've testified today, was to try to grasp the mindset of the DK leaders, to try to understand why they did what they did. Very ambitious project, on the one hand. On the other hand, one can conclude that you have not been able to speak to Pol Pot, you have not been able to speak to Nguyen Chia, you have not been able to speak to any other members of the Standing Committee or other than Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan. You have said yourself on numerous occasions that you are doubting the things that Khieu Samphan have been saying to you or that he has been writing in his book. Ieng Sary you are calling a devious, manipulative man. I'm not sure as to how many mid-level cadres you have been speaking. What makes you conclude that you have actually achieved this very ambitious goal of the book, that you really know what was in the mind of Pol Pot when he made decision X, Y, or Z?
Any biographer who pretends to know what is in the mind of his subject is deluding himself. A biography is an attempt to get close to a personality. Now, at the time at which I was writing, which was just after the end of the guerrilla war, I think I got as close as anyone could reasonably hope to do. But surely, it's like any book, an inadequate attempt. And I say that not as a self-criticism, but it's the nature of writing biography.
Now, Mr. Short, now I'm completely agreeing with you. But maybe I wasn't listening correctly, but I haven't been hearing this reservation about events or thoughts of leaders earlier. Are you saying, let me give one example. You've been calling Nguyen Chia the alter ego, if I remember correctly, of Pol Pot. We all agree that you didn't speak to any of them. We all agree that you were never there when they spoke to each other. I think we can agree that you never spoke to anybody who was on that particular topic, who was present when they were speaking. What made you say that Nguyen Chia was in fact the alter ego of Pol Pot? Or would it be fair to say that it might be the case, or that you think it was, rather than that it actually was?
I think we would have to go back to the transcript, but I have frequently used the words "my understanding is" or such terms throughout my answers. As to Nguyen Chia and Pol Pot being the alter egos of one of the other, that is based on interviews I did with mid-level cadres to whom I spoke at some length about exactly what that relationship was. And these were people who had had direct contact with both of them, not, I'm sure, together, but who were in a position to form a judgment, perhaps right, perhaps wrong, on how they operated. And it was on that basis that I said, according to my understanding, Pol Pot was Nguyen Chia was in a sense the alter ego of Pol Pot.
Thank you for that answer. Then, if indeed you had been introducing every answer to the question with words, "It is my understanding," or "It could be like this," but my understanding of the way that you've been testifying is that you were very certain in respect of certain events or thoughts or policies from the DK period. Is it fair to say that what you have meant to say when you were answering questions, that it was always to my understanding, or it's my speculations maybe sometimes, it's my conclusions sometimes? Because I would really like to have clarification on that issue.
President, Mr. Expert, please await the prosecution. You may proceed.
Your Honours, we object again. The question is extremely wide and vague. If, again, and I repeat my objection from earlier, if specific statements can be put to the expert, if he can be asked whether in relation to those specific statements he is certain or he drew an inference, that is entirely appropriate. But to be asking him now to qualify the last 2.5 days of evidence as matters on which he is not certain is improper. It will simply not elicit helpful evidence for the chamber.
Mr. President, I will be more specific. Although I have to say, Mr. Short is not a witness of a certain event. Mr. Short is an expert, a very intelligent expert, I might add. He's perfectly capable of understanding a general question. But let me be very specific. On numerous occasions, you have testified about a policy in respect of the treatment of Lon Nol soldiers and Lon Nol officials. You have stated that there was a policy basically to execute them once captured. And well, I can get these specific quotes for you, but I'm sure you remember saying that. And my question to you is, when you have been testifying that, is that based on how you really think it is, that is really enough evidence to support that, or is that something that you conclude, something to your understanding? If it's the first one, please offer concrete evidence of this policy.
You have just given an example where it is not opinion, it is not interpretation, it is fact. We know that Lon Nol soldiers above a certain rank, unless they were able to dissimulate their rank, and we know that high officials, again, unless they were able to dissimulate, were executed. There is abundant testimony to that effect. Some of the statements from the Khmer Rouge themselves bear it out. If you wanted a list, I would have to go back to my book and my electronic notes and tell you exactly where it came from, but you are as capable as I of seeing the sourcing. The point I would like to make, and I understand what you were driving at earlier, no one can know for certain what is in anyone else's head, what their thoughts are. My book is based on my judgments. I would say judgments rather than interpretations or conclusions, are based on what was said, either in documents or in interviews by those I spoke to.
Although I'm getting ahead of the subject that I had in mind, you're saying there's abundant testimony about the execution policy of Lon Nol soldiers. There's even Khmer Rouge cadres were saying that. Let us take one example. You've been writing about that in your book. You've been answering questions from the bench and from the prosecution. The execution of Lon Nol soldiers in Odong in 1974. What is the concrete evidence. What are your sources that in fact Lone Nol soldiers or officials were executed as a result of an implemented policy?
President, let now we resume the proceeding again. Counsel for Mr. Nuon Chea, please repeat your last question so that the expert can respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. The expert remembers the question because I think, Mr. Short, you are now looking for the sources of your earlier testimony that, in fact, the execution of Lone Nol soldiers was the result of a policy. I have no problem whatsoever to have you read, again, what were your sources.
Yes, I thought I would take advantage of the break to refresh my memory. The principal source was Pipun. There is also American testimony, Diak, Wilfred Diak's book. I note that there's a reference to Réalité Cambodgienne and also talking to villagers. Now, which one of those sources specifically refers to the execution of the Lon Nol soldiers, which is what you're interested in, at this, 12 years afterwards, I'm afraid I can't be very helpful. Pipun certainly we discussed at some length the policy of executing captured soldiers. So I would feel fairly certain that at least some of that information came from him.
What have you done to double check if Pipun was somebody on a level to actually know about his policy or to actually have been there to witness it? What have you done to research this American military historian, Mr. Beek, that he was in fact right what he has been saying in his book? You're not only, Mr. Short, an author, you're also a correspondent, you're also a journalist with the BBC. I might add, one of the most renowned institutions in the world. You know, also as a journalist, what it is to check your sources, to double check your sources, and to see from where did they have it, and were they even in the position to say something about policy or in actual executions in this particular matter in Udong in 1974. What have you done to convince yourself that the sources that you were using were in fact in accordance with the truth?
Biography, like politics, is the art of the possible. You check, you verify that your information is consistent with other information, but a biographer is not, or a historian is not a judge in a court of law. The standards of proof, happily, are not the same. In this case, Pipun gave me his version. I quoted three other sources, or three other sets of sources, because I spoke to more than one villager about this matter. Everything was consistent with itself and was consistent with other accounts, with all the other facts about this sort of circumstance that I was able to discover about the Khmer Rouge throughout the period immediately before they were in power and the period they were in power. So to me, yes, it was fair to make a judgment that this was correct.
Let me, if you allow me, Mr. Short, take it to a next level. What was it that Pipun said to you that made you conclude there was a policy? What did he say? Yes, there are standing instructions to all the commanders that all Lon Nol soldiers or officials should be executed. Did he, for instance, speak about a telegram in which that was put down? Did he speak about a speech of Pol Pot or Nuon Chea to high-ranking cadres where it was discussed? Did he, in any other way, say something to you which made you say, yes, no doubt there was a policy of executing Lon Nol soldiers and officials?
Unless I'm mistaken, I didn't say there was a policy that had been laid down from the top I may be mistaken. What I said was it happened. In the case of Udong, they were executed after they left. As far as I'm aware, this is only what the documentary evidence I've been able to discover, there was no written document instructing people to execute former Lon Nol officers and high officials. Pipun himself said when the first fighting started in Ratanakiri in 1968, it wasn't that there was an instruction. It followed from the policy that the set of policies which the Khmer Rouge were following, and soldiers knew how they were expected to behave. That is not the same as having a policy document read out saying 1, 2, 3, you shall kill in this way and that way. But the result was the same. The result was that people in those categories were executed.
But what were the specific words of Piyun convincing you that every soldier, every Khmer Rouge soldier knew what to do? How did cadres from the Northwest Zone, for instance, in 74, 75, know that whenever they captured Lon Nol soldiers or officials, they had to be executed? How did they know that? What made Piyun make you convinced, aha, that's convincing evidence?
What convinced me is that it happened everywhere. Now, I'm saying I'm unaware of any document, but the zone leaders would meet from time to time when you had congresses or central work conferences or central committee meetings, and they would go back with their understanding of the policies to be followed. Now, the outcome, the result, was that, and it was followed irregularly. It wasn't absolutely uniform. Not every Lon Nol soldier was killed, not every high official was killed. But in general, that was the outcome throughout Cambodia. It's difficult not to make a connection between a centralized policy meeting, central committee meetings, work conferences, and what is done on the ground afterwards. But there's no smoking gun, there's no document which signed by Nguyen Chia or Pol Pot saying, do this, do that, do the other.
Are you now shifting from whatever Piyun has been saying to you to it happened before? And if you do, please elaborate on where did it happen before. I don't have to remind you, Udong was 1974. It was way before 17 April 1975. Where were there concrete examples of this policy apparently being executed by low-ranking cadres? Where in Cambodia, 1974, 1973?
My discussion with Pipun began with 1968, which is very much earlier. And it was put in terms of drawing a clear line of demarcation between ourselves and the enemy. Udong was a particular instance which I've quoted in my book. April 1975, when Phnom Penh was taken, I would argue there is abundant evidence that the same thing happened again. There is evidence from the new people of what happened to Lon Nol soldiers. I'm not pretending that I am in a position to tell you exactly what happened in every corner of Cambodia. I'm simply saying from the limited evidence, and it is limited for all historians of that period, that is available, it's all completely consistent. That everywhere where we know what happened, Lon Nol soldiers above a certain level were executed, and high-ranking officials likewise.
With all due respect, Mr. Short, we're still talking about Udong 74. You're shifting back to Pipun again. I still haven't heard concrete facts and circumstances, concrete evidence, which can convince everybody in this courtroom that there was a practice, a policy of executing non-null soldiers. You were saying that it happened somewhere else in the country. I haven't heard you giving evidence about that. It's a very serious allegation that before 75 there was such policy. So I'm asking you again very concretely, what is the evidence making you say there was a policy?
President, expert, please wait. The prosecution, you may proceed.
Mr. President, I was going to object earlier. I refrained because I thought my friend might move on from the point. The question's been asked and answered about 3 times, put to the witness in different terms, answered by him comprehensively. He's given his sources. He's described the process by which he came to the conclusion to which he came. I think this point has been exhausted, and my friend is simply asking the same question over and over again.
Mr. President, I agree with the last sentence. I am asking it over and over again. That's because I haven't heard an answer which is convincing. We're speaking about a very concrete incident in 1974, Odong. We're speaking about sources, and I'm trying to establish, I'm not badgering some witness, I'm trying to establish with this expert what made him write that specific paragraph in book on page 255. That's what we're here for. We're here for sources.
President, the objection and ground for the objection raised by the prosecution to the last question is valid and sustained. Of course, the questions are repetitive and the expert is instructed not to respond. Counsel, please move on.
I'm not quite sure if I understand the ruling. We're at a very crucial point, and I'm asking an expert to be specific on his sources and the reliability and credibility of his sources. What else should I be doing here? I move on, Mr. Short, to the actual executions in Odong. So I'm moving away from the policy part. You've cited an excerpt from a book from an American military historian. I've looked at the specific pages of the book that you're quoting. What made you say that what convinced you that he was the one knowing what happened in Odong in 1974?
I gave him as one of a number of sources for that particular paragraph. I did not say, and I have absolutely no idea 12 years later what is in that book. You've looked at it. I don't have that kind of photographic memory. The fundamental basis for the statement that these people were killed after leaving Udong was my interview with Pipun and conversations with villagers. Diak and Reality Cambodienne, we can check them together and come back to this later. But I can only say that in my best judgment, I believe that to be true. You do not have to accept my belief, but that is what I believe to be correct.
Would it be fair to say, quoting your early testimony, that what you have been writing about Odong you deemed reliable for a book but not reliable for this court? I withdraw the question. I can continue to another line of questioning, Mr. President. I don't know if you would like to take a pause now.
President, you may continue until 3 p.m.
Thank you, Mr. President. As a matter of exercise, according to the same lines, Mr. Short, I would like to read out a quote to you from your book. That is on page 10, first paragraph of your book, English ERN 00396-202 and French ERN 006-39461, page 21 of the French book. It reads as follows. All through the late spring and early summer of 1975, columns of evacuees continued to crisscross the country. Khieu Samphan's colleague, Hu Yuan, whose blunt talking had started to infuriate the higher echelons of the leadership, watched an unending procession of city dwellers struggling past the bombed-out town of Skun, 50 miles northeast of Phnom Penh, at the beginning of May. The sight of their fires burning in the darkness by the roadside haunted him. And then he's been quoted, "Those people were truly wretched," he told Nguyen Chia later. Now, I think we can agree, Mr. Short, that it is not a terribly important passage of your book. But nevertheless, I would just like to ask you about your methodology about using this specific example. It's something that Nguyen Chia has been saying. What made you write down this particular passage in your book?
I thought it was significant because it's virtually the only example I've come across of any, not senior member of the leadership, because Hu Yuan was not a senior member, but a member of a group with some influence remonstrating with a top CPK leader. I didn't come across any other example of this. And you will have seen the source was a series of interviews with Ping Soi. And Ping Soi was with Hu Yuan at the time, and Hu Yuan told him what he had said to Nguyen Chia.
I have seen your sources, and I've concluded with you that is the only source. And because it's the only source, and because it's about something Nguyen Chia has been saying to Hu Yuan, what made you convinced when you wrote it down that your source was in fact telling the events how they happened? That Nguyen Chia did in fact say that. As you know, there's one source. People say things all the time. Did you look for a corroborating other source?
I think it would have been quite difficult to find a corroborating source. I was very happy to find one source who was able to give that kind of information. It was not the kind of thing that people say all the time. I spent many hours over a period of weeks, and I returned on several visits, months apart, to Si Ping Soy. We talked about the time he and Hu Yun spent together in early 1975. I found his account, when you talk several times over a period of months to a person, and he gives you basically the same account, it lends it a certain credibility. I found it credible too because it gelled with everything that I knew about Hu Yun and about his attitude to the radicalism of the Khmer Rouge set of policies. I had no reason to doubt it, and I have today no reason to doubt it.
I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I'm just picking this example, which is, again, not terribly important, but just to focus on the way that you have been using sources, also if it's only one source. Did you have a mechanism in place to somehow, if it was only one source, leading you to a certain conclusion, to have it double-checked, to find other sources, albeit circumstantial, to corroborate it?
With respect, that is a very lawyerly approach. You asked earlier, is it reliable for a court of law? And you withdrew the question. I haven't been told not to answer. Yes, it is reliable for a court of law, but it was not written with a court of law in mind. That is to say, when I wrote my book, this court had not been thought of. Or if it had been thought of, no steps had been taken towards it. So the standard of proof that you seem to be seeking is not the standard of proof that I was using in trying to discover the truth as a historian. For a historian, if a source appears to be credible, if what he says is completely consistent with every other known fact, and if there is nothing to contradict it, that is prima facie an extremely believable statement.
I agree with you, Mr. Short. I'm just asking these questions because, and maybe wrongfully so, I get the impression after 1 day, 2 days of testimony that whatever you've been writing in your book is always fully backed by credible and reliable sources. That's why I'm focusing on this particular point. To move on to a sort of last subject of methodology and the use of sources and use of earlier books, etc. What I'm going to say might upset some people. I'll try to formulate it as neutral as possible. One could say that before you started writing and researching your book, there was a very dominant narrative about the things that have happened in the DK period. And that's the part that might offend certain people, but there seemed to be a very strong Anglo-American French narrative of the events in the DK period. Now, we could all agree that the American policy in DK was disastrous. The French weren't very good at it either before that. All those scholars were all raised and educated in those systems. Now, the question I'm asking you, and maybe it's a difficult question, but I hope you understand. How were you able to avoid the trap, if I might call it like that, of getting into that dominant Anglo-American French narrative? Vickery calls it the standard total view, I think. What did you do to make sure that you just didn't go in there?
I did not read until I'd got a little way into my research. I didn't read very much that had been written before. It is a way of avoiding the preconceptions which other historians, other writers have laid down. But your question is a very good one. There certainly is a standard total view, as Vickery said. As I indicated to you, one of the very early writers, Ben Kiernan, I found completely misguided on many points. I certainly did not follow either Chandler or Kiernan in the interpretation which I came to regard as the correct or the best way of looking at the DK system. That said, any narrative, I often say a biography tells you as much about the writer as about the subject. It's an exaggeration, but there is a grain of truth in it. We all interpret things, we all understand things through our own experience. Now, my experience, as I've told you, has been in China, in the Soviet Union, much less time in Vietnam, and a certain amount of time here. But that makes it a different way of interpreting. I recognize the strength of your question. I can't give you a complete answer because there isn't one. All I can say is I tried and I brought a different perspective to bear than other writers who've been in this field.
I understand your answer, but would it be possible for you to give concrete examples? Of course, you've said that you studied the Vietnamese and the Chinese archives, but one of the things, for instance, that we find very lacking is the input of Chinese or Vietnamese scholars about what happened in the decay period. Did you make serious efforts to try to get away from the dominant narrative at that time, which is still the dominant narrative, and try to really get underneath the things?
One of the problems is that the Vietnamese narrative today and the Chinese narrative today is not that different from the Western narrative. It was different in the early 1970s when Mao and the ultra-leftists were in power in Beijing, but that's a time long ago. The only corrective, if you like, was that I had studied and immersed myself in Chinese politics, and in particular in that period of the Cultural Revolution and the views that the ultra-left had. So at least I was familiar, I was able to make comparisons and parallels with what happened in a revolution which was not totally dissimilar in another country. And I think perhaps that has been a help.
Which, Mr. Short, is a nice bridge to my next subject, and that is the ideology of the Khmer Rouge. I have been hearing your testimony today and yesterday when you were saying that the DK revolution or the DK ideology was something was sui generis. It was, I have you quoted here, as the most radical revolution. leaps forward were made to a radical communist state, world's most radical revolution, etc., etc. Would you be able to tell again or to explain again what were the fundamental differences, not in practice, not in the way it was working out, but in theory between, on the one hand, the DK ideology, and on the other hand, the Vietnamese communist ideology, the Chinese ideology, and maybe if we even have time, the Russian, the Soviet one. So I'm not talking about, low-level cadres executing it wrongly, etc., but the fundamental differences in theory.
In the classic Marxist-Leninist model, once a revolution triumphs, and this was the case in China and it was the case in the Soviet Union, most markedly in China, you have a period which Mao described as new democracy, the people's democratic dictatorship, where those who are not against us are with us. In other words, it's a broad, it's a temporary, usually, attempted reconciliation of bringing together all the forces which are not actively hostile to the revolution. The same was true after 1917 in the Soviet Union. It was a little bit different because there was the war against the White Russians, there was the Western encirclement, and so on. But in both countries, that was the model. You had a period of new democracy where the new regime became established. Then radicalization came later. Happened in China after the Korean War. But Mao's original idea was that there would be a transition period of at least 12 years during which there would be a new democratic front, and only after that would more resolutely communist policies be implemented. There was never any thought of that in democratic Kampuchea. That's one major difference. There was no attempt to bring together in a common front all those who could be united with. The other really major difference, and we touched on this the other day, was that in China and in Russia, proletarian ideology, the ideology of the working class, was held to be fundamental. Khieu Samphan explained to me that in democratic Kampuchea, it was a matter of transforming your mind. And he said, I remember that Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia had, although they were of bourgeois origin, of not poor peasant origin by any means, they transformed their thinking and were, as such, communists and revolutionaries. And that's what everybody else had to do. This is a completely non-standard interpretation or vision of Marxism. It goes back, in some respects, to the French Revolution, which was an alliance of peasants and intellectuals, peasants and bourgeoisie. And that's fundamentally what you had in DK. The Leninist model was not followed.
Maybe if I could rephrase the question. If we bring ourselves back to 16 April 1975, so before the actual taking over of power or the liberation of Phnom Penh, what would be the difference in ideology or in policy or in theory between, on the one hand, the Khmer Rouge and on the other hand, the Vietnamese or the Maoists, or in an earlier stage? Because I still don't see the fundamental difference in theory between, on the one hand, the Khmer Rouge and on the other hand, the Vietnamese or the Chinese.
Well, let us take 1949 in China. It's a subject, forgive me for talking about that rather than Vietnam, but it's the subject I am most familiar with. By 1948, 1949, huge numbers of junior officials, bourgeois, in the Chiang Kai-shek, that is the nationalist government, as well as most ordinary people, were completely fed up with the venality and corruption of the Chiang Kai-shek regime, basically welcomed the communists with open arms. It was pretty similar in Phnom Penh. People thought, at last the war is over, we will all get together. I remember Chun Chun's wife, and she should have known better, he, after all, being part of the movement, saying, we all thought we'd go home to Phnom Penh, that I'd make cakes for my parents, and life would be normal again. That was the expectation. And it didn't happen. There was no attempt to unite with those who were outside the very narrow Khmer Rouge ranks. That is a fundamental difference. You may say it's a difference in practice, but behind the practice there was a difference in theory, which is we cannot trust anyone who is not part of our core.
Mr. President, I see it's 3 o'clock. I would like to have some guidance.
President, the time is appropriate for a short break. We will take a 20 minutes break and return at 3:20. Court officer, could you assist the expert during the break and have him return to the courtroom at 3:20? Thank you.